So my name is Caio da Silva Pereira Neto. I'm a professor at FGV Law School, and I'm here today interviewing Professor Alison Jones. Professor Jones has come from King's College in order to teach a course at our global law program. Professor Jones is one of the foremost experts in European competition law, and she's written widely about this. So we're going to talk a little bit about the trends on competition law in Europe at this point. So Professor Jones, it's great having you here at FGV. It's been a wonderful week of courses, and I'd like to start by asking you about a hot topic worldwide, that is whether we need to rediscuss the goals of competition law. I think there is a lot of discussion about that. It's been a while that the goals have been very much focused on consumer welfare, and there are a few scholars that have been defending to rethink about these goals and maybe focus more on the process of competition and not so much on consumer welfare. And I'd like to know what's the status of this debate in Europe and how do you see it?
Yeah, the debate of what the goals of the EU competition law rules should be is as old as the rules themselves. In the early days of enforcement, the Commission was quite heavily criticised for focusing too much on the process of competition, a process outcome rather, a process objective rather than an outcome objective. But since the 1990s, the Commission really embarked on a modernisation programme, starting with its approach to anti-competitive agreements under Article 101, then looking at its approach to merger control, and then lastly 102. And in a series of regulations, notices and guidelines, it's set out its very clear view that it thinks that the main purpose of the rules is to protect the competitive process as a means of protecting consumer welfare. A couple of things to say about that. First of all, the EU competition law rules, unlike some other systems of competition law, are bedded in the EU treaties. They are specifically stated to be designed to protect to prevent competition in the internal market from being distorted. And the question of whether or not you can divorce the competition law system from those wider EU aims is a recurring question. So in recent years in particular, one of the questions that has arisen is whether or not other treaty objectives such as environmental protection, full employment and social progress should be something which should be taken into account in competition law and policy. The Commission's view in the stated guidelines, in the current guidelines, is very much this is a efficiency evaluation. We look at the harm on competition and weigh efficiency justifications against that. And there's now a debate as to whether or not that process is standing in the way of environmental sustainability agreements and particularly collective bargaining arrangements for self-employed. And the Commission is in the process now of thinking about these things. It's issued some guidance setting out when collective bargaining arrangements involving solo self-employed people with undertakings they're providing services to are compatible with Article 101, and it's in the process of drafting guidelines on sustainability agreements to provide greater clarity to business as to when they might be able to cooperate to try and achieve more environmental outcomes on the market.
Super interesting, and I think that's this interface between competition law and sustainability. I think that's a worldwide discussion at this point, and how firms can cooperate without being punished under competition law to save the environment, right?
Yeah, so I think there's some concern that the approach set out in the current guidelines doesn't provide enough guidance and is making firms fearful of cooperating in a way to try and deal with the negative externalities on the environment. So it's trying to deal with these sort of market failures and there's quite a robust debate going on in Europe with slightly different approaches and views being taken by some of the national competition authorities and the European Commission. So we're kind of waiting to see how the final guidelines will look. But the Commission is certainly going to provide a lot more clarity on that. And actually one other point I should mention is that the Commission has also brought proceedings against firms that it considers to be engaging in agreements which will harm the environmental outcomes. So it brought cartel proceedings against manufacturers of cars who had agreed not to compete in relation to trying to reduce the harmful emissions of their cars. And their view is certainly that often it is competition itself which will drive innovation, which will achieve beneficial environmental outcomes.
Wow, super interesting. So let's move to another topic. Let's talk about cartels and leniency program. What's the current status of cartel investigations, and how do you see the leniency program evolving in Europe? I think in many countries we're seeing a decline in leniency applications, and we need to deal with new investigations of cartels, but without so many leniency applications. So how Europe is dealing with that? Is that happening in Europe as well?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly, as you say, a worldwide debate going on about this, and there seems to have been, after at the end of the 1990s, many competition agencies around the world bolstered their fight against cartels and introduced leniency programs as detection mechanisms. And I think we are seeing a significant drop-off in those leniency applications. The reasons for that are not entirely clear. It may be because now of the multiple fora of investigations, the exposure not only to civil proceedings and corporate sanctions, but to individual sanctions, perhaps some criminal proceedings, private actions for damages spread across the world, that the benefits of cooperating through leniency mechanisms are not so clear-cut to firms as they were. And then, of course, the other obvious point is that these leniency programs are only going to work if members of a cartel think that the competition authority might find out about the cartel, even if they don't go and tell them about them. There won't be any incentive to apply for leniency unless they think it's likely to be exposed otherwise. So I think the success of leniency programs will depend on a sort of more holistic cartel policy, which doesn't really just rely on leniency on its own. So I think to ensure that the fight against cartels is sustained, I think competition authorities need to think of a range of measures which will try to ensure that the costs of engaging in cartel behaviour will exceed the benefits, which can be very, very significant. So they need to think about increasing detection rates and the sufficiency of sanctions at the end of it. So I think a range of measures needs to be considered. Prioritization of the fight against cartels. Many competition authorities around the world have a lot of pressures on their time and resources. They're concerned about increasing concentration in markets and reinvigorating their merger policy. They're concerned about trying to deal with the mounting power of certain companies, particularly in the digital space. They're being urged to do something about high pricing in some markets, and pharmaceutical, they're thinking about how they can make sure that competition law and policy doesn't stand in the way of sustainability agreements. So they've got a lot of pressure on their resources, but I think cartel enforcement is incredibly important, especially at in the current time in the world where many jurisdictions are facing cost of living crisis. The temptations to cartel might be quite high. They will have significant impact on consumers. So ensuring that resources are still prioritized. Competition authorities will need also to think about diversifying detection techniques, not only perhaps tweaking their leniency programs to make sure it's as effective as they want it to be, thinking about bringing in a range of other complainants, a broader group of whistleblowers, training public procurement officials who are in a good place to detect bid rigging in public procurement processes, and perhaps bolstering their powers to proactively uncover cartels, perhaps through screening tools and electronic screening tools. Perhaps working with businesses to encourage compliance, and then making sure that they're using the full range of sanctions that are available to them, perhaps beyond corporate fines, to individual sanctions if they're availability, and recommendations perhaps or debarment and exclusion to try and ensure that the costs of cartelization are real, and to try and offset the significant benefits and profits that can be made to firms.
Major challenge ahead in that direction. But you mentioned civil procedures and damages suits as well. I think this is a particularly important topic for Brazil at this moment. We're making adjustments in our law in order to boost private litigation, potentially, especially damages actions. So I'd like to understand also how Europe's dealing with that and how private litigation is going.
Yeah, it's been a long process. In Europe, it's taken a very long time for private enforcement to take off. It's been clear since the 1970s that the EU competition law rules have direct effect in the member states. That is, that they confer rights and obligations on persons which must be enforced and safeguarded in the national courts. But it's not really till the last 15 years or so that private litigation, and particularly damages litigation, has begun to take off. And even though it has begun to take off, that initially started in quite an uneven way, with most of the litigation being focused in 3 member states, the UK, which was then a member of the European Union, and Germany and the Netherlands. The Commission felt that this was an unsatisfactory position, and it wanted to do more to try and ensure greater amounts of litigation and in a more harmonised way, and also at the same time to try and ensure that it doesn't undermine public enforcement of the rules. So it introduced a package of measures, including a directive which is designed to ensure that all victims of antitrust infringements can get damages at the national level, and it's tried to harmonise rules and remove some of the obstacles to litigation that were occurring in some member states, such as the non-existence of disclosure rules, short limitation periods, to try and to harmonise the rules in that area. And I think they've also made a recommendation on collective redress to try and encourage class actions, which can be quite important in damages cases where individuals, claimants might not have suffered significant amounts of loss, but the class as a whole has. And it's also issued guidance for the national courts on how you try and quantify harm in damages cases and deal with the passing on defence. And I think the damages directive had to be implemented in the member states by the end of 2018, and it does appear, some studies that have been done, that damages actions are growing in a broader range of member states now, but there is still a considerable amount of litigation in the UK as well, facilitated by a range of factors.
Thank you very much. I mean, this is very interesting, and I think Brazil will probably follow some of the paths of Europe a few years behind. I think that's where we are on this matter. But anyway, thank you very much for the interview. Thank you for being here with us and for teaching this week with us. It's been a pleasure to have you at our school.
Well, thank you very much. It's been wonderful to be here. Thank you.